Tomorrow seems a bit frightening. Laud isn't here this morning. I'm not sure if he's not feeling well or what, but if you've ever sat in a class with Laud, sooner or later you have heard the story of his conversion. Laud was a young soldier, World War II in Europe, and the next day his unit would be entering what history now calls the Battle of the Bulge. And the chaplain had set up an area, and he called together as many of the young men who would listen and basically said, "Boys, some of you will not be going home." And God used that moment to touch his heart. Because tomorrow, the next day, was a day of battle. It was a day from which many would not come home. For some of us, maybe it's a day when you've had your annual physical and you go in and see the doctor and he says, "Well, there's some things here in the test that are of concern." And they run some more tests and the diagnosis comes back that you have cancer. They lay out a course of treatments, but you know that the road ahead will be very, very hard. You know, sometimes it's just a young high school graduate deciding, "Hey, I'm going to go off to college halfway across the country." And while it's an adventure and it's exciting, it's such a change. Mom's not going to be there to cook for me or do my laundry. And Dad's not going to be there to put gas in the car or whatever the case might be. And tomorrow seems just a little bit frightening. Just a little bit frightening. We're to that point in the Gospel of Luke where Jesus is facing the morrow. In less than 24 hours, he will have been tried, crucified, died, and been buried. We're all familiar, I think, with the story of the Garden of Gethsemane. And that's where we're at. We're in Luke chapter 22, beginning at verse 39. We're not going to go through the entirety. We're going to leave the arrest for tomorrow or for next Sunday, and Nick will be addressing that. And I want to break down what we have into two sections, verses 39 to 46 and 47 through 53. And so I'll be reading, as usual, from the New American Standard, if you'd like to follow along. "And he came out and proceeded, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives. And the disciples also followed him. When he arrived at the place, he said to them, 'Pray, that you may not enter into temptation.' And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and he knelt down and began to pray, saying, 'Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done.' Now an angel from heaven appeared to him, strengthening him. And being in agony, he was praying very fervently, and his sweat became like drops of blood falling down upon the ground. When he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping from sorrow. And he said to them, 'Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not enter into temptation.'" The Garden of Gethsemane is a night of prayer. Very simply, it is a night of prayer. Twice, Jesus exhorts his disciples to pray in verse 40 and in verse 46 as they enter the garden and the night begins, and just before he is betrayed, when they had been sleeping. Pray. Pray that you may not enter into temptation. In light of this moment and the events that are about to unfold, pray that you will not enter into temptation. That night would bring many temptations. Peter's going to set about going to war as he draws his short knife and chops off Malchus's ear. Many are going to be afraid. Matter of fact, all will abandon him and flee in different directions as the soldiers drag Jesus away. Later in the courtyard of the high priest, Peter will be tempted, and he will fail in that temptation to deny Jesus. It's going to be a hard night, and the morrow would be even more difficult. Pray. Nothing that I face tomorrow is going to be quite like what Good Friday held. Nothing that you face on the morrow will be quite like what Good Friday held. But that doesn't take away from the challenge of tomorrow. Events unseen, a future unknown. And yet at times, a chaplain's message to a young soldier, tomorrow you go into battle. A patient's trying diagnosis, you have cancer. A student's excitement and fear at the same time, bound up in a change in the chapter of life. I don't know what you're facing. Maybe right now you are in a very sweet spot of life. The roses smell good. Rejoice in that. Let your prayer be one of thanksgiving, because even then you need to be in prayer. Maybe it's a challenging one. Maybe life is difficult right now. Pray. Pray that you not enter into temptation in the events that will unfold in this moment. And yet for the apostles, sleep overtook them, didn't it? It's interesting that we generally think of that they were just tired. It's been a long day, and now it's late at night, and they're tired. Yeah, I'll be honest, I didn't sleep real well last night. And I am so tired. I told Rob, I said, if I happen to fall asleep while I'm preaching, just dismiss everybody. Sometimes you're just tired. Did you hear what Luke wrote? They had fallen asleep for sorrow. For sorrow. Their hearts were heavy. Jesus had told them what was coming, and yet, as we read through the Gospels, we realize they were slow in grasping that. They didn't quite understand until it all began to unfold. We know that they were just in the upper room and had shared in the Last Supper, and Jesus had said that someone's going to betray me. Surely those thoughts were still coursing through their minds. They had fussed and fought with each other as they jockeyed for position in the hierarchy of apostleship, who's going to be the greatest, and Jesus had to rebuke them. Maybe they still felt the sting. I don't know what all was at play, but they were sorrowful. And it simply weighed them down to the point where they had fallen asleep. And Jesus has to say, why are you sleeping? Get up and pray. Get up and pray. We look for answers in so many places. Life's hard, and we look for so many answers. Some quick fix thing. You know, we go to Barnes & Noble and 5 easy steps to financial security, 7 great steps to the perfect marriage, 3 steps to whatever it might be. There really is no easy road. And if you were here last Sunday, that's what we talked about, that the road in front of Jesus was not an easy one. He approached it, though, in prayer. Not only did he tell his disciples to pray, but we see the example of Jesus himself in prayer. He goes on, just about a stone's throw, we're told, from his disciples, and he kneels down, and we get just a glimpse of his prayer, just a portion of it. And we hear him say, Father, if you're willing, remove this cup from me. Jesus knew what tomorrow held. You and I don't know what tomorrow is going to bring, but Jesus knew what tomorrow held. He knew the physical suffering of the cross. He had seen crucifixions. He knew what was about to happen. But he also knew the spiritual burden of the cross. That moment in which he who knew no sin, as the Apostle Paul tells the Corinthians, would become sin for us so that we might become the righteousness of God. Some authors have called it the great exchange. He took our sin, gave us his righteousness. Doesn't seem quite like a fair deal, does it? But that's what he did, out of the depth of his love. But in this moment, in Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives, his prayer is, Father, if you're willing, remove this cup from me. In his humanity, remember, he is man and he is God, and in his humanity, the anguish and the burden and the sorrow of the suffering is heavy. If there's any other way, if there's any other way. And yet those infamous words, those words which often we try to imitate and mimic, yet not my will, but yours be done. Not my will, but yours be done. If I must go to the cross, if I must bear this burden, if I must take upon myself the sins of every man, then let's do it. For Jesus came to bring honor and glory to the Father. Jesus came to be obedient to his Father's will. And Jesus came to seek and to save that which was lost, you and me, and all mankind. The salvation of the world hung in the balance at this moment. You realize that? What a different story if the Father had said, okay, we'll call it off. And a legion of angels had come to deliver him from the hands of the Jews and the Romans. Or he had simply ascended in glory at that very moment back to the right hand of the Father and had left us all to well fend for ourselves, which would not have ended well. Two more things happen in this interaction between God the Father and God the Son. First of all, we're told that an angel appears. A heavenly messenger, an angelic being sent from the hand of the Father to be there in the garden with the Son. His disciples are sleeping. He feels isolated and alone. And God reminds him, you're not alone. I don't really know how angels work. People like to write books about them and paint pictures of them and fantasize a little bit about it. The Bible doesn't tell us a whole lot. But the book of Hebrews tells us that they are ministering beings sent to care for the redeemed, for the believers, for Christians. And somehow, in some way, in some manner, beyond my comprehension, God still ministers to his people with the very spiritual beings of heaven. Whether it's health or war or school or anything else, you're not alone. You're not alone. God ministers to his people. This angel appeared and came to strengthen him. And indeed, he did strengthen him. Jesus entered Gethsemane that night in agony, and yet he comes out with a victory won, with peace in his soul, all because he had talked with the Father. We see the agony of Jesus entering the garden in this picture of his prayer. He was praying so fervently that his sweat became like drops of blood falling down upon the ground. I listened to a Christian doctor once describe the physical condition where the intensity causes blood vessels to begin to break, and the blood mingles with the sweat. It's an actual condition. Jesus was so intense. Have you ever prayed so fervently that you sweat blood? I haven't. Jesus did. He knew what was at stake, and he agonized. And yet God the Father strengthened him. And he comes out of his time of prayer with a peace in his soul that allows him, when things get crazy here in just a couple of minutes, to tell his disciples, put away your sword, we don't need this chaos. That allows him to stand before his accusers like a lamb before its shearers. It does not open its mouth. That allows him to hang upon the cross when they're taunting him and saying, if you're the Son of God, come down from there, then we'll believe you. And he knows that that's not the way. He can face it all. Hebrews says that for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. The joy of honoring the Father, the joy of redeeming mankind. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. He could do so in the light of Gethsemane because he had talked with his Father. I can't encourage you enough. I can't challenge you enough. I can't invite you enough to be men and women of prayer. Verse 47 picks up the second part of the story. While he was still speaking, behold, a crowd came, and the one called Judas, one of the 12, was preceding them. And he approached Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? When those who were around him saw what was going to happen, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus answered and said, stop, no more of this. And he touched his ear and healed him. And then Jesus said to the chief priests and officers of the temple and elders who had come out against him, have you come out with swords and clubs as you would against a robber? While I was with you daily in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. But this hour and the power of darkness are yours. Even as Jesus is the second time exhorting his disciples to pray, this crowd, this mob, these officials, these police and soldiers arrive at the Garden of Gethsemane, led by Judas. Judas knew where to find Jesus, a place of retreat, a place of silence and solitude, a place of safety, a place where he often went to meet with the Father in prayer. And for the purposes of those seeking Jesus' life, a place apart from the crowds. How many times we have read that his enemies wanted to arrest him, his enemies wanted to try him, but they were afraid of the crowds. And so they came under cover of darkness. They came when everyone was asleep. And Judas knew where to find him. Judas, one of the 12. Judas, one who had sat at the table with him only a few hours earlier and had heard him say, this is my body, this is my blood. We talked a couple of weeks ago about betrayal. Judas comes up to him in the traditional greeting of a student to a teacher in that culture. Not only in Jesus' day, but even in our day. Hands on the shoulder and a kiss on the cheek. And Jesus rebukes him. he questions him. Judas, are you really betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? Are you really showing me a sign of friendship and submission to my role as your rabbi with a kiss? Later it would hit Judas hard. But for now, he simply hands Jesus over. And chaos ensues. Chaos ensues. In verse 36, we had heard Jesus tell his disciples, hey, if you don't have a sword, go sell something and buy one. I'm not sure I actually fully understand all that Jesus had in mind there. But he was telling them in some way or another, be prepared for what is to come. And I think Paul picks up on it better when he talks about how our weapons are not the weapons of this world, but that we clothe ourselves with the armor of God, and that prayer is one of our weapons, and that the word of God is the sword of the Spirit. But while Luke does not name Peter, John does, and tells us that this one who draws his sword is Peter. And he whacks off the ear of the high priest's servant. Good thing Peter had bad aim. You know, I have a feeling he was trying to lop off his head and all he got was his ear. Now, can you imagine the intensity of that? Did you watch the news at all? You know, if you watch the news at all, do you see the animosity and the anger and the hatred that is boiling up on the streets of our nation? Someone throws a bottle, someone throws a rock, someone throws a punch, someone launches tear gas. It just ramps up, and everyone's mad. Can you imagine being in that garden that night? And here's Jesus, you got 12 apostles, and this huge contingent of Jewish and Roman temple police and guards. And this one wild-eyed apostle draws a sword and whacks off the ear of the high priest's servant. You think tensions would have mounted? Do you think a few swords might have been drawn? I think we were on the verge of a massacre. I don't know that for certain. But look who's in charge. Jesus is. One word, stop. Stop. And I think that was directed not only to Peter, but to all of his apostolic band. And I think not only to those who followed him, but to those who had come out against him. Jesus, he is still the Son of God. He is still the King of Kings, and his word is authoritative. And he said, stop. No more of this. Don't you parents wish you could do it that simply with your kids? You know, that's all it took. Stop. And then in the midst of this, can you picture him? He comes over and touches Malchus on the ear, heals him, restores him. I almost like to picture Jesus bending down and picking up this ear off the dirt and brushes it off a little bit and slaps it back on there. No stitches, no bandages. Just, he's healed. Can you picture that? Now, the scripture doesn't tell us, but it boggles my mind. Can you imagine, you're there to arrest him, and he just slapped this guy's ear back on. And now I've got to arrest him? This makes no sense. Who is this man? People marvel. And yet as he does, Jesus then turns to those who came out against him. In the midst of this chaos. And he says, why at night? Why do you come out to me like I'm some kind of common thief? I have taught daily in your temple courts. I've not hidden. I've not worn a disguise. I've been very open and very public. Why is it that you come out at night? And Jesus actually answers his own question. He says, this hour of Jesus' betrayal, this moment of Jesus' arrest, and what is to unfold in less than 24 hours, this hour is theirs. For this is the hour of darkness. It's the hour of darkness. I think we're all pretty familiar with Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus in John chapter 3. It's in that conversation that we get teaching about being born from above by water and by spirit. We get the teaching about God so loving the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Do you know how Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus ends? This way. He who believes in him, in me, in Jesus, he who believes in him is not judged. He who does not believe has been judged already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. This is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and men loved the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light for fear that his deeds will be exposed. But he who practices the truth comes to the light, so that his deeds may be manifested as having been wrought in God. This hour and the power of darkness are yours. Because the light had come, Jesus, the light of the world. The light had come, but men preferred the darkness because their deeds were evil. And so it doesn't matter if he slaps a guy's ear back on after it's been chopped off by a sword. It doesn't matter if he's raised the dead in Bethany, his good friend Lazarus. It doesn't matter that he has given sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf, speech to the mute. Doesn't matter, because mankind prefers the darkness. And this hour, the night of his betrayal and his arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane so long ago, was darkness's hour. And they arrest him, and they lead him away. He will carry his cross to Golgotha, will be nailed, and will die. Because men preferred the darkness. And because that darkness had to be met by light. And on the third day, you know the story. On the third day, we get to sing, "Up from the grave he arose." Up from the grave he arose. Because the light triumphs over the darkness. Men may prefer the darkness, and this hour may have seemed like darkness won, but this hour was simply a part of God's bringing light to the world. You can almost hear the demons howling and Satan gloating, and God's going, if you only knew what was coming. If you only knew. Because this is how it's supposed to be. And so it does matter that he opened the eyes of the blind and gave hearing to the deaf and speech to the mute. It does matter that he raised Lazarus. It does matter that he slapped Malchus's ear back on. Because it all testifies to who he is. He is the Son of God. He is the Son of God. And so my encouragement to you today, my challenge to you today really is very simple. Whatever you may face in life, pray. And pray confidently that this one who himself is the light of the world also prays with you and for you. He lives to intercede for us, we are told. And he walks with us, for he had said, I will not leave you as orphans, but I will come to you. Lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. I feel so alone, but in reality I'm not. He is with me. And the chaos of my life is met by the authority of his voice as he rings out, stop, no more. And his light shines into my darkness and dispels it. The darkness of sin is overcome. Forgiveness and victory are wrought. The darkness of fear is defeated, and a spirit of courage and boldness takes up residence. The light wins. Always does. I'm going to ask our musicians to come up and lead us in another song. And as we sing, very simply, let this be a prayer. I don't even know what song we're singing, but let it be a prayer of faith, a prayer of confidence, a prayer of hope, that no matter what you face, we know that the light shines and the darkness cannot triumph over it. Would you stand as we sing?